As Losaranajara addressed the first few points of today's schedule, James listened with mild interest, not exactly able to contribute anything since said first points, all in one way or another, pertain to previous meetings of the Council, including things like recaps and acknowledgements of the protocols and logs from the previous meeting. As he had not been present, he didn't really have comments on any of it, and therefore he sat there and simply kept his eyes open for anything that would indicate trouble. The constant white noise of chatter that filled the room, since even honoured representatives of most primate species seemed to be utterly incapable of just shutting up for even a minute, didn't exactly make paying attention any easier, nor did it help with staying on guard. Although admittedly, James didn't know if he would have preferred it had it been dead quiet instead. At least the fact that everyone was whispering to each other made it a lot less suspicious if he would lean over to say something too, or hear something from his own company, who obviously also kept their eyes on the situation. Then again, he would have to be careful with that, given that Uton and the rest of the Zimiareskis company were sitting basically right next to him, which also included Sky. James didn't know how compliant the former Ketsir thief would be to whatever Uton may have asked of her, as he announced he would bring her here. However, he did know that she had quite excellent ears, and he would therefore have to be more than careful about what he would say in her presence. In the meantime, he did his absolute best not to acknowledge Uton's presence at all, treating the man like air. No interaction between them could have any positive outcome, and so he decided to avoid it whenever they weren't forced to interact by the proceedings. In the back of his mind, he also worried about Shida. He knew it must have taken incredible willpower for her to remove herself from the proceedings like that before things could escalate, and he was incredibly proud of her for doing it. Still, that didn't mean that she wasn't also still very much wrecked by the fact that her former father figure was still here in the room with James, and now, without her there to see for herself what would happen between the two. Sure, she could technically tune into the news broadcast or livestream, and have an eye on them that way, but James highly doubted that she would be doing that, considering the way she had left. He just hoped Coco would manage to help her deal with whatever she was feeling right now. Snapping out of his thoughts, James listened up as he noticed Losaranaja's tone change, while the luminescing fur of her body took on a slightly different shade. "Alright," the Pixemeria announced, and ran a hand through the fur on her face while slightly adjusting the way she sat on her small podium in the room's middle. "With that, point 4. Review of the previous meeting has concluded. Next up is our most important point of the day. Point 5. Discussion of a united reaction to the illegal attack on Dunama." James wasn't the only one who sat up straighter and focused his gaze more than before. The entire room seemed to somewhat shape up, as the topic that had brought not only them, but many other such conferences all over the galaxy together in the first place, was about to be discussed. "First of all, I would like to ask if anyone does not feel aware enough of the events to take part in the conversation," Losaranaja announced to the room, her purple eyes looking around attentively to see if anyone would already show signs of using this opportunity. "If that is the case, we would take some time to briefly review the event together to get everyone onto the same level. Should that not be the case, we would waste no time and get straight into the discussion." With that, whatever device each of the present representatives had connected to the hotel systems received a message with the same question, allowing them to vote on the topic like it had already happened a few times before then, although this was the first time James actually felt compelled to send his vote. He certainly didn't need a recap, and although he felt that there would still have been at least some value to make sure that everyone was on the exact same level of information, right now wasting no time felt a lot more valuable to him, if he was being honest. And it seemed that he wasn't the only one, because as the votes slowly came in while one primate after the next reached for their personal assistants, It seemed that not a single one of them felt like they lacked any information to comment on the topic. Seeing that that was the case almost made James reconsider his choice. The idea that none of the representatives had any doubt about their understanding of the situation somehow made it feel like the exact opposite may have been the case. However, his vote was already cast, and so he would have to live with it now. If he needed to clarify anything for them, he would simply do so as needed. "Very well," Lossaranaja loudly said through the amplifiers, once the result of the vote was finalized with a final vote of 11-0. "As it seems everybody feels sufficiently informed, we will now open the topic to discussion. As his people not only take part in this council for the first time today, but also share close ties to those affected by the illegitimate attack, we organizers of today's events have decided beforehand that the first word on the matter will be granted to the representative of humanity, Ambassador James Orwin. Ambassador, if you have anything to say or suggest on the matter, the floor is yours." James was, admittedly, slightly surprised that such a simple and very much sensible honour was allotted to him. He still half expected that his invitation here was going to turn out to be some kind of stunt or joke at his expense, and therefore he figured that humanity's close ties to the Miat would be, at best, ignored by the rest of the council. However, given that they were giving him the opportunity to speak, he was going to use it. "Thank you very much," James announced, as he stood up from his seat, while all eyes in the room gradually turned towards him, be they organic, or the mechanical eyes of cameras that now connected him to the rest of the galaxy. He truly wondered how many people would be interested enough to tune specifically into the meeting of the Council of Primates, although he figured that his presence here may actually help drive interest up just a bit. With his gaze gliding along the many similar and not so similar faces of his fellow primates, he began to make his statement. "My fellow primates, I don't have to tell you that the attack on Dunama was a heinous act of malice, like the galaxy has not seen in a long time. An orbital strike, like it was attempted on the home of the Miat, is unacceptable, even in the direst conditions of war. And here, it was not only undeclared, but also entirely unprovoked. The only appropriate reaction our order can show to such an event is to condemn it to the utmost and to offer our support to those affected by it. The Miat have been severely isolated from most of the rest of the galaxy, and it has already led to plenty of problems for their populace. If they now also have to worry about unjust, unprovoked, and frankly inexcusable attacks, it will only make things worse for Dunama. Therefore, the way I see it, offering them any support we can, on relieving some of the tension and aiding in their protection and recovery, should be seen as the duty of the entire community, and I would suggest that we primates should lead by example." Bowing his head to the other representatives in the room, James sat himself back down. "Not a bad speech," Admir commented over his shoulder, "but it seems like not everyone is all too happy with it." And indeed, although some of the present people had welcomed his words with a brief applause, others seemed to be far less convinced of what he said, and many low murmurs could be heard spreading throughout the room, as accompanying people leaned in to their representative to whisper something into their ears. Even the Pixameria in the middle of the room herself had one of her conspecifics walk up to her to seemingly clarify something with her. Meanwhile, James couldn't help but notice that the Simiareskis group to his right was almost entirely quiet, and seemed to simply observe the unfolding events much like he did. Soon enough, other representatives began requesting the word via their assistants, leaving it up to the organizers to decide in which order they would be allowed to speak. Locking his fingers, James stretched his arms out to crack his knuckles, readying himself for the possibility of quite long talks. And immediately, as the word was granted to the representative of the Tiasoko, it seemed that his suspicions were already turning out to be true. While I don't disagree that an illegal attack like this has to be condemned universally, I feel obligated to mention that primates in no way bear the responsibility for the attack, and therefore do not owe any reparations to the Miat. Representative Clanifia FF announced as he stood up, his forearms gesturing in even movements, while his round ears rotated agitatedly, almost as if they were already searching for anyone disagreeing with him. Our response to the current event should instead be to work together to strengthen our own defences, and thusly ensure that such a heinous act cannot and will not be committed against any of our members. A mix of approving and disapproving mumbling broke out amongst the participants, while James rolled his eyes underneath his mask, wondering how one could miss the point so badly, if he didn't do it on purpose. Obviously, James had in no way even implied that the primates were in any way at fault for the attack. In fact, he even knew who was responsible, so such an accusation would have been utterly pointless from his position, even if the other representatives did not know that. Investigators were still building a solid case against De Corte, and scraping together all the necessary evidence before announcing it publicly, making sure that nothing would be destroyed by possible accomplices. Already, James lifted his phone to make a request to speak again, ready to argue his point against such a laughable attack. However, before he had the chance to do even that, it seemed that Losaranaja used her privilege as the host to grant herself the word for a moment.
Forgive me, Representative Clanifer, but I do believe you misunderstood Ambassador Olwyn's point, she declared over her amplifier. I think what he was saying was not that we owe reparations to anyone, but that we should see helping the affected as our duty, not out of obligation, but simply out of the drive to be a good example to others and help those who need it. Is that correct, Ambassador? With those last words, she turned towards James, looking up to him with her glowing eyes. Slightly surprised that someone else had defended his point like that, James cleared his throat before standing up. That is correct. He verified her claims with a nod. As he sat down again, Clanifer seemed to have been instantly granted the stage once again, as he stood up instead. Reparations or not, the fact is that we should concentrate on defending our own people before we seek to help out those entirely unassociated. He repeated his earlier point in a more sensible manner, even if it still didn't hold much water, at least in James's opinion. The primate's beady eyes stared up at him, through semi-closed lids. To his renewed surprise, James was then informed by his phone that it was once again his turn to speak, as he was seemingly instantly granted the opportunity to defend himself here. Getting back up again after having barely sat down, James stood once more, and wondered if it wasn't about time that one of the other representatives could get a word in edgewise. Then again, if they wanted him to run his mouth, he would gladly give it to them. There is absolutely no indication that such an attack could also be planned against any of our people, he announced. Building up defences as our first act would not only be entirely pointless, but also show that we only care about ourselves. The next who spoke was the commander of the Grasselgap that sat on James's left side. Easy for you to say, the green primate announced, while holding onto the railing in front of him with all four of his feet. Humanity's borders have been closed for months and your defences are already built up. You don't have to worry about your defence. Not only is the closing of our borders entirely unrelated to the current event, humanity also has a much higher chance of being targeted by the same people that may attack the Miat, given our status as their allies, as well as our commonalities as Deathworlders. James was allowed to defend himself soon after. And even ignoring that, you will surely have noticed that humanity has also already offered aid to the Miat in both defences and resources, despite our current embargoes. The ship that prevented the orbital strike on Dunama was one of our own, if you remember. and we will continue to lend that aid to them, no matter the decision reached by this council today.
Entirely unrelated?
A voice then spoke up to James's right, making him snap around, as the representative of the Zimareskis was granted the stage. The upper-aged man, whose fur was already slowly greying along his back, giving him an almost silverback-like look, if it wasn't for the tail and sand-colored fur, pushed himself up on his back feet and stood tall as he spoke.
Is that so, Ambassador Aldwin? Isn't it so that the recent alliance between Dunamo and Earth was very much caused by the same events that have led humanity to close its borders?
The nearly black eyes looking out of the man's dark face were clearly searching for James's, although the tinted mask of his breath filter made them hard for him to find. James crossed his arms but sat patiently, waiting to be granted permission to speak instead of barging in, no matter how much words wanted to bubble out of him that instant. That was exactly what they wanted. They wanted to get a rise out of him, to make him speak out of line and ideally say something stupid, but he could pull himself together. Eventually, the notification reached his phone. With his arms still crossed, James stood up. "If you are looking to provoke me, you are wasting your time," he announced. "Despite whatever idea you may have of my presence, I am not here to discuss the crimes that were committed against myself in the recent past. Nor am I here to advertise myself as a candidate for councilman. I was invited to this council to discuss the attack on Dunama, and what the united response of the primates to it should be, and that is all I have been doing, and that is all I want to hear. If you are interested in other aspects of my life or Earth's politics, I suggest you should pick up a professional journal on the matter, or follow the ongoing investigations conducted by the galactic authorities closely. I could of course say plenty on the matter, but that is not why we are all here. We are here to discuss a crime not against me, but against the people of a world that has done nothing to provoke an attack, that has in fact stayed out of galactic politics as a whole for the longest time. But, in case that is what you are worried about, no. Aid offered to Dunama would not automatically also be offered to me or my people. Neither would I ever suggest that, nor would anyone organising such affairs be stupid enough to not realise that that was happening, should we try to make it so anyway. So please, let us focus on Dunama and its people that have been so unjustly attacked." Of course, he could say plenty on the matter. Oh, could he ever. Not just about the unjust imprisonment and torture that he had endured at the community's hands, but also about the economical isolation that Dunama had unjustly suffered, and the ensuing crisis caused by it. Or maybe just about the treatment of Deathworlders and other people who fell out of line in general. However, there would be ample opportunity for that during events that were more suited for such words. Right now, he would play by this event's rules, and simply discuss the reaction that the revered order of the primates should have to the attack. Not that that wouldn't help him, of course. If the primates agreed to aid Dunama, then its galactic isolation would easily be torn open, as no one could block all 11 revered primate species from interacting with the Deathworld in a trading fashion. And if the primates agreed to condemn the attack to great effect, then, well, that would mean that as soon as it would get out there who committed it, that perpetrator, and all who associated with them, would also already be condemned by this revered order. If he just held his hand close to his chest and played his cards right, he wouldn't have to get into any of the politics, and would still get what he wanted in the end. However, the expression he saw on the large monkey's face as they looked at each other didn't sit right with him at all. It was a calm, relaxed, and almost smug smile that only ever so slightly curled the primate's closed lips upwards, and it gave James all kinds of bad feelings about what the man was planning. However, whatever it was, he didn't get out with it right away. Instead, the previous back and forth continued for a while longer. The two sides of "we should be good people and help" and we need to watch out for ourselves first, were rather rigidly formed, it seemed, although it seemed that the side of helping was gaining slight favour over time, possibly caused by James's willingness to fervently argue with anyone who was trying to make nonsensical points against it. His nature-given stamina and nurture-given spitefulness really came in handy here, as it seemed that many of his opponents were quickly losing their energy as the discussion went on, while James was only getting fired up more and more, although he obviously still watched out to keep his temper in check. Gradually, he felt the mood in the room shift, and he also noticed that some of his fellow primates were starting to regard the passionate Deathworlder before them with less of a skeptical lens and with a bit more of the expected respect that they seemed to already be granting each other. Maybe he wasn't the worst pick for a politician after all. Eventually, as it really seemed like he was starting to gain some momentum, especially against his main competition of Representative Clanifier, it was of course inevitable that the Cimmeriski's representative would once again speak up as well. Pushing himself up again, the older man looked around the room, and suddenly, James could feel how the general chatter around him died down, while the man suddenly looked on into the crowd. It seemed like the core worlder may have been a bigger deal around here than James had noticed so far, possibly due to the lack of him actually taking part in the events, apart from one short comment. It was the exact opposite of James, who had constantly talked yet was only slowly actually getting the people's attention. That man seemed to have everyone's eyes glued to him immediately, without even needing to say anything of importance first.
I think it is about time that I too state my opinion on the matter,
the Cimmeriskis announced, and his tone clearly indicated that he indeed expected his opinion to hold quite a bit more sway than that of many others.
We have heard two main sides tonight, those who think we should offer aid first, and those who think we should mount our own defences. I must say, I am surprised that those are the two sides that have so clearly emerged, as they are both quite important topics. Admittedly, I expected a bit more unimportant drivel, as it tends to emerge in settings like this one, but I am impressed by Mr. Olwen's ability to boil the things down to their most important parts. As I have heard, they sometimes say on your world, I tip my hat to you, Ambassador.
He mimicked the motion of an invisible piece of clothing he would likely never wear being removed from his head for a moment. Underneath his mask, James grimaced.
You took a lot of work off my shoulders. Usually I'm the one who has to keep this gaggle in line, the monkey then informed James. Having someone else do it for a change was quite refreshing, I must admit, although I don't quite know what to think about someone like you having the ability to sway them like this.
As James's grimace deepened, he could hear mumbling behind him. Get to the fucking point, Tuya whispered, aggravatedly, as the man was dragging things out. And she wasn't the only one losing her patience, as James could also hear a deep bellow escaping from Conglorch's massive chest.
But why are those two topics so important, you ask? Well, I am going to tell you,
the still-talking representative then announced, and James could basically see everyone else leaning in closer as they listened, as if his words would surely make it all make sense, no matter what they themselves were thinking on the matter.
First of all, Mr. Olwen is correct. There is absolutely no risk of a similar attack occurring onto any of our worlds, much like he suggested. However, that does in no way mean we shouldn't come together to build up our defences. And secondly...
He made a brief pause in his words, first looking down as if filled with consternation, and then over at James with a more harsh expression, once again trying to make eye contact, as he finished his sentence with, Under no circumstances should we offer any aid to Dunima. Murmuring once again broke out among many attendees, as they tried to make sense of the old monkey's words, as it seemed he had somehow both agreed and disagreed with both of the established sides at the same time, while also doing the same for neither of them. James, however, had a dark premonition about what was to come next. Whatever the man still had to say, and obviously he still had a lot to say, also indicated by the fact that he was still not sitting down. It just couldn't be good. For a while, the man just stood there and watched the chaos that his words had caused, with an impartial expression. Given that the usual sign of "I am done speaking" around here was to sit down, everyone obviously expected him to speak up again, as he still stood. However, he gave no other indication that he had any intention of actually doing so. That was until Losarenaja once again took up her role as host and moderator for the event. "Would you care to elaborate your assertion, Representative Gloribal?" she inquired, with a slightly hesitant tone, while the luminescence of her body seemed to increase from her stress, now glowing in a green that was so bright it could be clearly seen despite the room's lights. Smiling that same earlier smile that James had despised even before the man had put this plan into motion, the man was then finally moved to speak up again, as he ran a hand through his greying fur. James also couldn't help but notice that next to him, Uton had a very stony expression on his face, leading the human to assume that the captain was internally preparing for something at this point.
"I am half tempted to leave that task up to Mr. Aldwin once again,"
Gloribal announced with a chuckling rumble under his voice.
"But he may not be quite as fervent about it this time, since he has so vehemently insisted on the heinousness and inexcusability, as well as unjustifiability of the attack. So I will settle for doing it myself. Or, more precisely, I will leave it to one of my trusted associates."
With that, he motioned next to himself with one of his large hands, which caused Captain Uton to stand up. After the introduction they had all gotten to the man via James's earlier protests, everyone already seemed to get a boost of anticipation by that gesture alone, and the murmuring died down once more, as everybody sat up just a little bit straighter. Now standing next to his representative, Uton towered over the older man ever so slightly, as he cleared his gravelly voice.
"Thank you, Representative,"
he announced with a nod of his head, before turning to fully address the room.
"I will not drag this out any longer than I have to. The reason why we don't have to worry about any more attacks like the one on Dunamur being conducted is that I, Captain Ferrimore Uton, personally ordered said attack. And the reason we cannot lend any aid to Dunamur, and also the reason why I ordered said attack, despite knowing of his unlawfulness, is that—" He paused for a moment, clearing his throat again. On his face, James could see that even Uton was seemingly more than just a little conflicted about his next words. "Is that there is currently a realized artificial sapient being harbored on that Deathworld." A moment of silence followed his words. And right after it, their effects were immediate. All protocol went immediately out the window, as the low white noise of chattering turned into a full-on, chaotic storm of words, as everybody talked over each other, not just the representatives and their company, but also the reporters and technical teams of the news, many of whom had immediately taken out personal assistants, presumably to quickly make contact with their offices and higher-ups to make sure more resources would be allotted to this broadcast quickly. It was possible that they were even trying to get someone to send this announcement onto all channels. An artificial sapient meant that everyone in the galaxy would have to know. Underneath his mask, James's eyes widened, and inadvertently, he brought his mechanical hand down onto the railing before him with a bang. Uton was lying, but what James didn't get was why. At least not for the moment. His thoughts had momentarily come to a halt. However, although he had not done so intentionally, his little outburst did briefly break through the chaos in the room, as many eyes quickly shot around to the source of the loud noise, where they soon landed on the grey, robotic hand that clutched onto the wooden rail so tightly
Then the material groaned under the pressure.
Ambassador?
Losaranaraja's voice asked nervously out of the loudspeakers, as she glanced up at him meekly, seemingly having taken his banging hand as an intentional demand for attention. Feeling that he may as well use that, while his eyes glided over the many huddled together groups of primates that all seemed to have something to discuss with each other, James realized that he was at an impasse. He could not call Luton out on his lie without revealing that humanity already knew who had ordered the attack. And he could not reveal that without having to answer a lot of other questions, some of which he didn't know if he was authorized to answer. Despite his earlier thoughts of maybe not being the worst person to be here, he had to admit it to himself that he was out of his depth now, and he could no longer tread through this minefield alone. "I would like to suggest a brief recess," he therefore announced. "It seems like everybody here needs a moment." Looking around, Losaranaraja soon nodded her tiny head.
"Indeed," she agreed. "Everyone, before we get into unraveling these rather tremendous claims, we will take a brief recess of 20 uniform minutes. Please use that time to calm down and refocus yourself so we can face these claims with a clear mind."
With that, she deactivated her microphone and hopped off the small podium, quickly hurrying over to the rest of her people. "We need to call Earth, now," James said with a turn of his head, while the rest of his team was already standing up to move. This is bad, isn't it?" Nia asked James, as she came up at him from the side, and he quickly put his arm around his sister to reassure her. "Not necessarily yet," he replied, more confidently than he felt. "But it may very well turn out to be." Just moments later, the human accompaniment had come together outside of the main conference room, huddling together in one of the hotel's many corners while James was on the phone with Earth. Of course, the broadcast of the conference had been closely followed back home as well, so it wasn't like he had to get anyone up to speed. "I have to admit, this was a turn I did not see coming, but using the captain as a scapegoat instead of acknowledging the actual perp is an interesting approach," Representative Kumar said over the phone, while James anxiously paced back and forth. "At least that sounds like you have an idea why they're doing it," James replied, hopeful that there may already be sensible countermeasures planned out for him by people with more clearances and experience. "It's quite obvious, isn't it?" Kumar replied. And although his voice sounded utmost serious, James couldn't help but feel that he was still being mocked a bit. "They're planting a false narrative early. They probably know that we know who really did it. So by getting out with their version before we are done building an ironclad case, they can muddy the water." "But we have evidence," James started to protest, but Kumar didn't let it go on for long. "So do they, if they've been at least somewhat smart about it. A false paper trail, a few either bribed or fanatical officers, some forged black box logs. It's going to take some time to definitively prove that all of that was faked," he said, and then paused, as if to see if James was catching on to what he was saying. "Time they can use to claim whatever they want about the attack, with it being just as believable as whatever we are going to say." James therefore voiced his thoughts. "They can get the people's attention into any direction they like, and spur on investigations into anything by simply hinting that they left evidence there." "You got it," Kumar replied. "I hate to admit it, but it seems we're being played a bit here." James inhaled deeply, and released the breath through his nose. "At least you're still sounding confident," he said, getting some hope out of the politician's seemingly unperturbed behavior. "Well, not all is lost yet, but things are going to be hard," Kumar replied, his voice turning even more serious, and carrying the clear implications of an order that was to follow. "Just tell me what I can do for damage control," James said, to which the representative cleared his throat. "You're not going to like to hear this, I know, but we have decided to go with a scorched earth approach," he said. "Scorched earth?" James questioned. Not liking the sound of that indeed. They weren't actually thinking about declaring a real war, were they?
Break everything wide open, Kumar said, after a moment of pause. No secrets, no horse barred. Put it all onto the table. We're going to turn this into an actual game of chess. Public knowledge and all. That plan got the majority vote. James scoffed and reached for his face, before turning back to look at his company with nothing but concern. We're going to be arrested, he said. Not really worrying about himself, but nothing but unwilling to pull everyone else he had brought here into such a situation. Don't worry about that, Kumar responded with firm confidence. You have my word that it will be handled, and that nothing is going to happen to all of you. If we have to raid the entire station to make it happen, we will. But don't worry, it will not come to that. For now, you have my permission, no, my order, to go absolutely ham in there. Bring it all down. Take every dark secret everyone in there has, ourselves included, and drag it out into the light. We're going for the nuclear option. If they want to muddy the waters, then we'll chlorinate this cesspool. James exhaled. You think that's enough analogies for one order? He asked, as it sank in for him that he didn't really have a choice here. As their representative, he was going to have to trust in his people. If they guaranteed this would turn out well, then he would have to believe that it would. Actually, I have one more, Kumar replied. Take your good arm, and throw some serious shit at the fan.